Hi and welcome back. We are beginning our quest into the plant world. Finally, we are going to look at photosynthesis. We just finished cellular respiration, really focused on that mitochondria within animal cells. Remember, plant cells have mitochondria as well, and they do the exact same cellular respiration that we do, but they're a little bit different than us for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is they have a chloroplast organelle in their cells as well, and this is where photosynthesis occurs. So we don't do photosynthesis, they do, but they also do cellular respiration. So we're going to go into photosynthesis, and you're going to see the beauty of how these two are intermingled together and how they depend on one another and how we depend on plants to do their job and plants depend on us to do our job as well. So let's talk about photosynthesis. So this will be Roman numeral 4, photosynthesis. Let's define this. So photosynthesis. Photo meaning light, synthesis means you're making something. And in this case, we're using light energy to ultimately create glucose. So I want you to think of it as an opposite reaction from cellular respiration because it is the exact opposite reaction. Remember, in biology, we got that yin and yang balance and struggle going on, but it ultimately leads to how things work. So you got photosynthesis, it's using light energy to produce, actually we're producing two things. We're producing glucose and oxygen. That should sound very familiar. And so before we get into the reactions and stuff like that, let's go into the plant for a little bit. So this will be Roman numeral A, the site of photosynthesis. And in our case, well, in a plant's case, it's the chloroplast. So in plant cells, chloroplasts exist in any green part of a plant, most often concentrated in the fleshy part of a leaf. So if you're looking at a nice big green leaf and you break it open, you can see that there's like that fleshy part on the inside. The reason it's green like that is because of chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are present in the green parts of a plant. I'm going to switch my pens here. Oops. Excuse me. Get some new ink for you. So present in the green parts of a plant and specifically in leaf cells, in leaf, there are specific cells called mesophyll cells. Those kinds of cells are chock full of chloroplasts. So within a leaf, mesophyll cells are filled with chloroplasts. So if you're looking at a leaf, let me get my green. You're looking at a leaf cell. And if we were to cut that leaf right here and look into it, here's under a microscope, a very low magnification microscope, here's what you would see. You would see this waxy cuticle layer on the outside with these cute little, pores over here. And have these little pores. We'll talk about those in a second. And inside of them, you would have these mesophyll cells all just kind of lined up. They all kind of go rectangular and very geometric for the plant world. But inside these mesophyll cells, it's all of these chloroplasts. You would see tons of chloroplasts. They of course have a nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, and all that, but the predominating organelle inside these cells is a chloroplast. The structure that I drew here, this little pore here, this is called a stomata. And this little pore allows for O2 to go in, CO2 to go in and O2 to come out. This is how we get our oxygen, and that's how they acquire their CO2. But that's going to come into these reactions for photosynthesis as well. Now remember what the structure of the chloroplast looks like. Do you remember back in our lessons from the chloroplast and mitochondria, we kind of drew one out. So let's take one of these chloroplasts and blow it up here. So if you have a chloroplast, remember you have an outer membrane, you have an inner membrane, and within the chloroplast, you have tons of little other membranes, these other little structures. So let's define what these guys are, because we're going to be hanging out here in the chloroplast. There's no right or wrong number for how many of these little circles there are. I just randomly drew it. So let's label this really quickly. You have your outer membrane. You have the inner membrane space, just like the mitochondria. You have your inner membrane. I'm just going to shorthand them because you've seen this before. Now here's where it gets a little bit different because we are now in a chloroplast. Inside the inner membrane, this fluid that everything's floating around in here, this is called the stroma. And these little circles, each little circle is called a thylakoid. And each thylakoid is a membrane wrapped around, so it's like membrane, membrane, membrane. And inside the thylakoid is the thylakoid space. And a stack of thylakoids is called a granum. G-R-A-N-U-M. Okay, now we got the base layout of where photosynthesis is occurring. In the whole entire time we're learning about photosynthesis, you're going to be thinking that's a lot like the mitochondria but different. That's exactly what I want you to think because it is. And these two organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, they work hand in hand together, especially in a plant cell because they have both. But you're going to see many similar things that are occurring within the chloroplast that we saw in the mitochondria. They just might be a little bit backwards. So, excuse me, I'll pick up my eraser. So now, let's get to the overall photosynthesis reactions and let's get into a little bit of this. So, big B will be photosynthesis reactions. All right. So just like cellular respiration, we have an overall reaction. So here's the overall reaction. The overall reaction would be essentially light energy, which you can't, there's no chemical formula for that, so you don't need to worry, but it's going to be plus CO2, and it's going to have some water, so you're going to be adding water, so plus water. And it's going to create glucose and oxygen. So C6H12O6. This is the exact opposite reaction from cellular respiration. Put ATP here and you have the opposite reaction from cellular respiration. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they feed each other, which is gorgeous. The light energy obviously comes from the sun, but the whole point of photosynthesis is to make something, not to break it down like cellular respiration did. So it's a little bit different. And just like cellular respiration was a redox reaction, you can imagine the exact opposite reaction is also a redox reaction. In this case, CO2, okay, so remember on the last one that glucose was actually oxidized? This time it's getting reduced. And water is oxidizing. So CO2 gets reduced, water gets oxidized. Everything has changed this time around. And so remember, if you're getting oxidized, you're losing electrons. If you're getting reduced, you're gaining electrons. So it's completely backwards, which is great because we need to balance things out. It is checks and balances in the biological world. And up until the 1930s, I'd say, we used to think that photosynthesis meant that carbon dioxide was becoming oxygen. We used to think that plants exchanged gases like we do. In our capillary beds between our veins and our arteries, we, exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen for cellular work to happen. And we thought plants kind of did the same thing. But the truth is, oxygen gets made from photosynthesis because water gets split. It's a splitting of water. During cellular respiration, how do we make water? We add electrons to oxygen and hydrogen to make water. We're not using CO2 to make water. We're using CO2 to strip off its electrons and protons and all that. And we make a ton of CO2 because we're breaking this down. So it is truly the opposite reaction, which is really, really, really cool. So within photosynthesis, there are two phases of photosynthesis. So let's go over them. Here we go. So two phases. Whereas cellular respiration had three, this only has two. So two phases of photosynthesis. And then we're going to get into the details of them, of course. So the first phase, we call those the light reactions because they use light. The light reactions. If you want a nutshell definition for the light reactions, this would be the photo part of photosynthesis. This is when water splits into oxygen. So H2O splits into O2. That's the photo part because it's using light. Now, the synthesis part, we're going to have another cycle. Just like we did in cellular respiration, we had the citric acid cycle. In photosynthesis, we have the Calvin cycle. This is the synthesis part. This is when CO2 is used to make glucose. So CO2 to glucose. So I'm going to give you a big sketch drawing on how this all works. This is going to be your overall introduction into photosynthesis. So I'm going to draw a nice big chloroplast, a very simple chloroplast that only has one granum in it because I don't want to clutter up my chloroplast drawing for you. So this would be the overall summary in a picture. There's my outer membrane. There's my inner membrane. Here's my stack of thylakoids. And I'm going to keep the stroma nice and empty right now for the rest of it. So for the light reactions, you literally have light. Happy little sunshine. Light comes into the plant. Within every chloroplast, you have a pigment in there. That's why it's green. And the major green pigment that that the plants use is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll has a couple different flavors. You have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A is what does all this reaction stuff for the plant. So within the thylakoid membranes, it's chock full of chlorophyll. All the different pigments, pretty much all the other pigments you would see in a plant are there as well. But if you're looking at the green part of a plant, tons of chlorophyll, specifically chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll B is there as well, and it's giving all of its energy to chlorophyll A. because what these pigments do is they absorb all that photon energy from the sun. That light is a bunch of photons just attacking it. And all that energy, that light energy, gets absorbed by these pigments. And now they want to let that energy go somewhere. So you're going to see something very similar to what we know already. But what's happening, because in the plant you have this constant supply of water, hopefully, if you're a good healthy plant, you're going to have water. Water is going to go into the thylakoid membrane. Tons of reactions are going to happen that we're going to talk about later. And one of the biggest products is oxygen. So now we can breathe. Literally, we can breathe. The other thing that's going to happen during these whole entire things, you're going to have an electron transport chain. You're going to have something we are very familiar with. During this whole time, you're going to be making a little bit of energy. And you're going to be making an electron carrier, just like we did before, but they have a different name. It's not NADH or FADH2. This time it's NADPH. All these little letters, I know, but they all stand for something beautiful. So NADP, I forgot the D. NADPH, and a proton, because protons like to hang out with the electron carriers. Those also get made during that time. So this would be the light reactions. These occur in the thylakoid membrane. So just for a summary, occur in thylakoid membrane. And essentially uses light energy to split water into oxygen. Now on the other side, this is the photo side, the synthesis part. This would be the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes CO2 from the atmosphere. Takes CO2 from the atmosphere. It enters the stroma and actually goes through a cycle. This would be the Calvin cycle. During this cycle, enough rounds of the cycle, you're going to make glucose. It takes a couple turns, but you'll get there. Now, during this Calvin cycle, it needs a little bit of energy to get this done because light isn't interacting with this part of the reactions. So the Calvin cycle actually uses up some ATP. The amount of ATP that gets made just goes straight in. The electron carriers drop off their electrons in the Calvin cycle. It's a little bit different. And they actually recycle back in. So since ATP gets used, it's going to become ADP, and it's going to have its little phosphate along with it. That's going to go back into the light reactions to become ATP, and this just keeps going. Same thing with NADPH. This is going to drop off its electrons, and now NADPH has its reaction, lets go of its electrons, and becomes NADP+. And those go back in. And that whole thing goes. So the Calvin cycle, this occurs in the stroma. Calvin cycle and the light reactions are intimately tied together. You need the light reactions to create all the ATP and the electron carriers in order for the Calvin cycle to go, and you also need the Calvin cycle to make your electron acceptors and your ADP to keep things going as well. So they work together beautifully. But this happens during the day. At night, you don't have light going on, so the whole cell just kind of shuts down, and that's why plants have learned to adapt, and they really prevent the loss of, that they close up their pores, they do a whole bunch of stuff that they really conserve their energy well. So as soon as the light goes away, they basically use up whatever they have left over, and then it's done. So this is a daytime kind of thing. And that is your introduction into photosynthesis. Our next round, we're going to start off with the light reactions, and then we'll do the Calvin cycle. This one goes a little bit quicker than cellular respiration because there's only 2 phases to it. But you're going to see a lot of similarity, just in a different way. So hang tight. We're going to come back and do some light reactions. Thanks.